All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. Good afternoon, or good morning, or evening, depending where you're from, where you're logging in from today. My name is Samir Varma. I'm a partner in Thompson Hine's International Trade Practice Group based here in Washington, D.C. My co-presenter who you see on the screen right now is Dan Utso, who's Senior Counsel in the International Trade and Transportation Practice Groups based in Columbus. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the second in a series of webinars examining what the shift in presidential power could mean for the country. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to you within the next few days to all the attendees. The presentation is intended for the general information of individuals and organizations on matters of current interest. Disclaimer, the thoughts and opinions expressed today are those of the individual panel members only, do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the panel members' clients, employers, affiliates, or even Thompson Hine. The content should not be taken as advice. The views expressed here are for informational purposes only. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Now, I know there are quite a few people attending this webinar. It's a very timely topic. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but honestly, in the interest of time, we may end up addressing certain questions after the webinar. We're going to record them and answer them, over email. Feel free to shoot Dan or I an email at a later time if you do have any additional questions. We're happy to help. There is CLE credit today. CLE credit for today's webinar is pending. Please be sure to complete the verification of attendance survey. The link to the survey is posted right now in the chat box. We'll also paste a link in the chat at the end of the program, and I will announce the attendance tracking code at the end of the program as well. In the handout panel, you also see a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we're sharing today and bios of today's speakers. Again, thank you so much for your interest in today's topic. We'll go ahead and get started on about, Trump and Trade 2.0, tactics, tariffs, threats, and transformation. As I mentioned earlier, right, Dan and I will be tag teaming today's webinar. Oh, I should have mentioned, for those of you who don't know us, Dan is a proud Ohio State University alum. I'm a University of Michigan guy. Today's webinar is really proof that even, in today's climate, two people can put aside their differences, come together and create something, I don't know, special, right? Right, Dan? Like special with this webinar, something magical we're gonna do today. So that's the two of us. Here's the agenda for today. We're gonna go over a quick recap of some of Biden's final trade actions, really since in the last month, the things that he put forward. We'll talk about the Trump administration 2.0, what really his goals are for the next 4 years. We'll go over a quick review of some of the heads of the trade-related agencies and related governmental functions, just so you can see who the main players are. And then, we'll do the meat of the program. Dan's going to spend the bulk of the time here today talking about all the tariffs and more tariffs and the counter tariffs. We just got an email saying that China does retaliatory tariffs just in the last hour. So, there's a lot to talk about on that end. We'll conclude the presentation talking about some other important initiatives, some sanctions and related export initiatives, and then really just a trade potpourri if we have time at that point. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with just a quick recap of Biden's final trade actions. Earlier this month, or earlier last month, on around January 13th, Biden put forward a new sort of interim final rule about export controls, which created licensing requirements for the export of certain AI-related products, including on advanced computing, integrated circuits, and closed AI. This is really to combat China and the use of these products, and making sure that the U.S. has an understanding of where the U.S.-made or U.S. origin products, or even foreign direct products of U.S. origin goods are being exported if they're going to China. Similarly, there was a ban on connected vehicles. Actually, it was both the sale and importation of connected vehicles from China and Russia. This was a final rule. It goes into effect on March 17th of this year. However, there is a rolling implementation based on model year 2027 for software. That's the car. The car model year of 2027 for software. Hardware is 2030. There were dozens of new Russian entities added to the SDN list, or specially designated nationals list. There's a sense that maybe Biden wanted to get these in before Trump took office, simply because he was concerned about whether or not there would be any additional sanctions or additional entities added once Trump did take office, so he threw that in. There were a bunch of Chinese entities added to BIS's entity list as well. The UFLPA, which is the forced labor list, there's continued expansion of those entities. Now there's nearly 150 entities on that list. These are entities that mine, produce, or manufacture goods with forced labor. Finally, or not finally, but next, the de minimis rules, which we'll get to also a little bit later. There's which basically removes the current exemption of goods valued at less than $800 to be exempt from having to pay duties upon import into the United States. There's a comment period right now open until March 24th, 2025. It basically the main key of this is that items that are normally subject to a lot of these Section 301 or China-related tariffs or other aluminum, steel products, things like that, that are being imported at valued at less than $800, they've been exempt from having to pay these duties. That exemption will no longer exist. In addition, President Biden on January 6th blocked the Nippon Steel acquisition of US Steel. This was an interesting situation because CFIUS, the interagency panel that reviews such transactions for national security concerns, basically determined that they weren't sure if there was a national security risk, and they sent their report to Biden, and Biden had been saying for months that he was going to block the deal. He did end up blocking the deal. Finally, we wanted to mention there are a number of open Section 301 investigations, which fall under USTR's purview. They can impose tariffs on goods coming in from a country that is acting in a way that restricts United States commerce. There are a number of open investigations. We'll have to see how the Trump administration handles these open investigations. Also, there was a forced labor finding against Kington Alumino, which is, I think it's the first Chinese-owned company in the Dominican Republic, and now all aluminum products from the DR, from this company, will now end up being seized. Dan, you want to touch on Trump's administration?
Sure. Thanks, Samir, and thank you all for joining. I know we have a number of our wonderful clients, longstanding and new, a number of individuals and organizations that we deal with and have great partnerships with in terms of our clients are members, or we're members, or on the boards of those organizations. And thank you all, whether it's our friends at NASCO down on the US-Mexico and North American borders, Tiffany Melvin and Rachel and the gang, or the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada, et cetera, et cetera. And I raise that because we're going to cover a great deal of information here, as Samir said off the top. And this is part of Thompson Hine's series of a number of issues. Trade's just a piece of this immigration. Our immigration team led off this series, as you know, as many of you know. And so we're going to cover a broad ground here. We do drill down on these, and you will see there's going to be no shortage of activity we do at Thompson Hine on the trade issues. And what we've been doing, frankly, for the last, going through to Q4 of 2024, is we've been meeting with clients and doing briefings on these very issues. We've been meeting with trade associations, and we're always happy to jump on the line, and even with our contacts. Now, with contacts and others that are non-clients, we have to give general information, but we're always happy to get on the line because, as you will see, there's a broad scope of topics that we have to cover. And as we're all living, I was talking to some of you less than 12 hours ago, right? Or more than right about 12 hours ago, as tariffs were coming in the wee hours on China. And so we're here, use the information, and don't always worry about the meter running, and so to speak, with us lawyers. I also want to add, just as we start this off, that whenever we say the T word, not tariffs, not trade, but Trump, that generates emotion, and particularly over the past weekend in certain areas, in certain countries as well, our neighbors. And what we're here today is we are not endorsing particular policies or politics. Samir had the fun part of giving all the disclaimers at the beginning. Our job is to advise what we see based on all of our intelligence on the political side, on the policy side, and most importantly, for all of us on the practical side. So starting there, in our discussions over the last quarter and going beyond before that, what I've been concerned about is there's a view, I think, among the business community in particular, that we've been through this before. We've done trade, we've done tariffs before. We lived through this. We lived through COVID. This time is going to be different. The size and scope of what we're talking about today is much broader than it was in 2018, 2019. And contrary to what you may have seen over this past weekend, it is much more organized and disciplined than it was in the past. And the other piece is, so the idea that we've been through this before, or that these are just threats, that this won't happen. And I think as we see today, I can't tell you what exactly is going to happen and when but we can tell you what the framework is. And so when you hear certain things, when it's out there in the noise, that you can kind of slip it into this framework that we've been using now for multiple months and has been confirmed by what we saw on day one executive orders and what we are seeing in practice now. So that's what our goal is here today, is just to slice and dice these issues. And if you want more, is please don't hesitate to reach out. So the starting point for that, of course, is why are we even talking about tariffs? Why have tariffs even come up? I'm not here again to get, I am sure your most avid President Trump supporter can tell you, I'll get much more deeper in this, or those that don't support the president, very few people seem to fall in the middle, that may not agree with any of this. But there's basically three buckets that we're talking about here, or three pillars. There's an America First security and defense policy, but the president and this administration is not big on hot wars. They don't want to be in a hot war. They don't want to be the world's police officers. And so that you can see on the slide that touches on a number of issues, whether it's the debate over Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, what's going on kind of in the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to the Gulf, et cetera. the NATO discussions, the president makes no hesitation to comment on NATO contributions. And of course, what we just saw over the weekend on fentanyl, drugs, undocumented migration, and relatedly foreign aid. Why am I bringing this up? Because if you want to influence other countries to engage in behavior, one is to use your strength or foreign aid, and we're not going to do that, and at least not to the scale that we've had in the past. And then if you skip to the third issue there, cutting regulations, and what we're of course all seeing with Mr. Musk and the Doge is government reform, and so that cutting red tape, and sitting right there in the middle is economic nationalism, which is, there is a view, I think, in some circles that this administration doesn't care about budget deficits. They do. And when you talk to folks there, they certainly do. And they are very concerned about the trade deficit. And that's driving so much. If there's anything you take away today, is that the trade deficit is the scorecard. And just listen to the president talk about trade for 5 minutes or 5 seconds. He's going to talk about the deficit. But related to that is that if you're going to do some things that are designed on the trade side, on tariffs and things of that nature, and look at deals and deal with undocumented migration, how are you going to stimulate the economy to offset those, what undoubtedly will be increased costs? And that's unleashing supply, particularly in the energy sector, cutting regulations so that companies invest and spend and cut that red tape, and ultimately give a tax cut and extend the tax cuts. So there's that counterbalance. So what we saw this past weekend is really only one piece of the puzzle, and it's a very small piece of just that, a component of that piece. What it really is that it's going to come on the other side, which is how do you unleash what arguably is U.S. business? That's the way this comes together. We have to put kind of, as the president said last week, we want to put a wall, not just between the United States and Mexico now, but a wall around the United States, a tariff wall. And if you're going to do that, then you have to unleash the U.S. economy and energy, et cetera. So First is people as policy. So Samir, you can lead us off with who's kind of making the call here. And then when I come back to tariffs, I'll talk a little bit about how this all played out over the weekend.
Yeah, and so there are obviously a number of people in the administration who are all part of this entire web, doing the America First policy and building the wall around America and the pro-nationalistic ideas. And so I'm just going to run through it really quickly. I mean, Howard Lutnick whose Senate confirmation is pending. It's actually today for Secretary of Commerce. For those of you who don't know, Howard Lutnick is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, has been involved in politics more recently. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, he was confirmed a few weeks ago. He's, obviously the most recently a senator from Florida. Scott Bessent, who has managed a number of different hedge funds. This was sort of has managed a number of hedge funds. I think the most recent one was Key Square Group. He's sort of outside the box, but has been starting to get more involved in politics and really with Trump over the last few years. Let's see. Next we have, USTR, Jameson Greer. His pending Senate confirmation is this Thursday. He currently he's a partner at a law firm, King & Spalding, right now. He was the chief of staff for Robert Lighthizer at USTR during Trump's first administration. So follows, Bob Lighthizer and a lot of the sort of tariff centric policies. He's currently acting as a lawyer or serving as a lawyer, but which kind of begs the question, Dan, actually, now that I think about it, some lawyers are called to serve and go in the administration while you and I do webinars instead, but that's neither here nor there. So next we have Kristi Noem, who is the secretary who was confirmed as the secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. She was obviously the most recently the governor from South Dakota. Randy Scott, who's now the commissioner of, or whose confirmation is pending, the commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. He previously served as chief of the U.S. Border Patrol and was heavily involved in some of the actions of late in Trump's presidency at the southern border. He actually served under Biden for a little bit, but then left sort of a few months or 6 months into Biden's presidency. We have a number of trade advisors. Kevin Hassett, who's the director of the National Economic Council. Kevin Hassett has been a long-time economic advisor. NEC is within the Office of Policy Development, so it helps the executive branch in their economic strategy. Kevin Hassett has been sort of a long-term conservative advisor. Peter Navarro, who most people know, obviously a long-time advisor to President Trump. He served in Trump's first term. He's one of the main proponents of Trump's trade policies. He's coming back as senior counselor for trade and manufacturing. The title really doesn't matter. The reality is that he's going to be one of the main influences on Trump's policies as relates to tariffs and the like. Tom Homan, border czar. He was the director of ICE for a number of years. You may recognize his name from some of those media since then. He's pretty involved in a lot of media outlets. He's now back. He's in charge of the various deportation initiatives that are ongoing right now, inter alia, and many, many more people. I don't know if Dan, if you wanted to mention any other additional people after that, outside of, but there's also people obviously on the Hill, including, the Senate Finance Committee. The two main people are the chair of Senate, Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho, and Ron Wyden, who's from Washington, who's the ranking member on the Democrat side. And then House Ways and Means chair rep is Jason Smith, while Richard Neal is the ranking member on the Democrat side. But really, this just goes to show you that all of these individuals, we've listed, about a dozen of them, but really this trade policies are everywhere. And a lot of people are going to be influencing the president, but a lot of them, he has chosen who represent, have the same ideals, the same ideas that Dan had mentioned just previously. Now we'll jump into tariffs.
Yeah, no, so now turning to this, go ahead to the next slide, Samir. So now turning to the issue at hand is, the question along the way, and you'll hear us use these throughout our conversation. Samir's already mentioned Section 301, but this is the list of authorities in our system, as pretty much everyone knows. Congress really has responsibility for anything to do with money, including trade, right? And for all commerce among nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they delegate that power. The president either has his authorities in foreign relations, or the president has authority as delegated by Congress. And so Congress over time has delegated authority to the president. And for most of the time, that's been pretty straightforward. That's a relative term compared to where we are now. But really what we saw the president dust off are those right in the middle on this list in his last term, that with the help of then U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, they dusted off, well, safeguard tariffs, Section 201. Those are very specialized tariffs that when we were going after a specific product at that time, and you see the durational elements on the right. So that was laundry machines, washers, dryers, et cetera. And right here in Ohio, the president made that announcement at a great company here in the state. And then the president went into national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, the Section 232s, and among others, and that is finding a national security. There is a report that's done by the Department of Commerce. And so that took time, right, to do that report, to do that homework, and that became the steel and aluminum tariffs under national security. And that was our first go at the exclusion process too. And if you can remember, those were like on Excel spreadsheets when Commerce was doing that. They were just rolling those out the last time. And then Section 301 were the China tariffs and a handful of others. And this was a large comprehensive study of our relationship with China and the unfair trade practices. This was USTR Lighthizer's baby at the time. That report is masterful, actually. When you read the report, whether you agree or not is a different conclusion, but it's well done, is the piece. And then there was an exclusion process set up for a series of lists and the accompanying retaliation, where we had an exclusion process. But those really target unfair trade practices, things like forced joint ventures, intellectual property. The IP kind of can get a little tricky in that section, but and a number of other issues that we had that we historically have with China. Now, added to the list now is we just saw this weekend, and we saw it the prior weekend with Colombia, is what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This gives the president, once a national emergency is declared, the authority to do a number of things. Tariffs is not explicitly listed. It's only been used once, arguably, to impose tariffs, but it's usually confiscating goods. It's when we recognize that there's bad people out there, terrorists, et cetera, we will use that mechanism to go after that and seize assets, confiscate property, money laundering, et cetera. It's used. It's why it has been used in that context many times, but not for tariffs. But it does give the president that authority, and it's immediate. There's not the lengthy reports that we saw for national security and unfair trade practices. It requires a declaration of a national emergency, though, under a separate statute, the National Emergency Act. This can often get confused with national security tariffs under 232. This is an emergency. National security is 232s. The president on day one declared two emergencies, national emergencies. He declared an emergency at the southern border, dealing with undocumented migration, fentanyl, and a number of other issues. And he declared a national emergency on energy that we needed to unleash. And there were two related executive orders. One was the declaration of the national emergency on energy, and basically that we have all these assets, we rely too much on overseas energy, and the related piece was another executive order unleashing America's energy. And so we have two pending. We also have a number of other national emergencies, by the way, that's the hook that you can use. And so when we saw the tariffs this past weekend, they hooked back to that southern border. And there was a cross-reference, and we were intimately involved in that, to the energy executive order now, or the emergency order. There are two others that I think we will be hearing about, is Section 122. When we say these sections, these are all sections of various trade acts. We're trying to spare you the legalese here, but Section 122 And this is a measure that was put in after President Nixon used the IEEPA to put on tariffs, or the related statute, the IEEPA. Congress later came back and amended that and said if there are large of serious balance of payment deficits, essentially trade deficits, that you can take actions, and you can see, but that came with some strings attached. The tariff can only be up to 15%, and it's limited to 150 days, and Congress then has to approve it or to extend it. I should note on the IEEPA tariffs, there's a check in that system for the president's abuse is Congress via a joint resolution, meaning both chambers of Congress have to issue a resolution that's identically worded that will remove the national emergency. That's the basis for the IEEPA. So IEEPA is immediate, Section 122, arguably immediate. Those others, 232s, 301, 201s, those take some time and reports, and you can see there's all those hooks. And then there's a long-standing one, Section 338. I have to admit I was a bit dismissive of it a few years ago when we started looking at it, but it's been around a long time. You can say up to a 50% tariff. It was not, when we entered the World Trade Organization in the 90s, it was not grandfathered in. So there's a real question whether we can use it, I think, but it's out there, and it is something the USTR, Lighthizer in his past life really likes. And so we may hear a little bit more about Section 338, and those are countrywide tariffs. But I will add, both under IEEPA, Section 122 and 338, you do not have to put the tariffs on a country writ large. You can target subnational governments. You can target states, provinces, small areas. So you think about it, we often see this with IEEPA, we're targeting a specific faction that's maybe a rebel faction or a terrorist faction within a country. You could be that targeted if so desired. So next slide, please, and we'll move at the quick step here. So that's the basis. So the question always is, can the president do this? Now, everybody was waiting. We were at the inauguration. Here's the speech. Is the president going to announce day one tariffs? And then everybody was like, see, we told you he wasn't going to do tariffs, because he didn't do tariffs on day one. He put out the America First Trade Policy Memo that sets that a series of reports will be due by April 1st. It confirmed the model, the framework that we had been working with a number of our clients and had been talking about. Number one is that there's basically three baskets or tranches of tariffs. Number one are what we just experienced this weekend. What we have styled tactical or transactional tariffs. They're singular issues. So border, the fentanyl, I'm going to use tariffs to get leverage on you. Or we see that they're sectoral. We're going to do a 232 review of steel. So there's a list in Section 4 of this memo that came out on day one that confirms that there's, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but these are kind of one-offs. We're going to use tariffs as the leverage in our negotiations with you. The second basket are what we've styled transitional or transformational tariffs. These are essentially tariffs that are meant to go on to address long-standing problems, particularly the trade deficit. And so there's a series of measures in that second basket that deals with this. This is often where the global supplemental tariffs, or what the president has talked about, global tariffs of 10 or 20% are. The third basket, we had two originally. China has kind of become its own, and that's Section 3 of the memo, that middle bucket, Section 2. Section 3 of the memo is China, and you'll see we'll get into some specificity here. I flag this because it's very important. When you hear things about tariffs, which basket are you talking about? So we've seen a lot of media reports. Oh, the president's going to go just after certain products, or the president himself says semiconductors, pharma, et cetera. And then people say, well, that means he's not going to do a global tariff of 10 to 20%. Nope, they're different tariffs, right? And the president, and look, that's not the fault of the media. That's not the fault of others advising. The president himself often commingles these issues when in communication. But I think if you stay in these three lanes, it's very helpful. So next slide, please. So on that first bucket, like I said, used and leverage in negotiations, hopefully are meant to be short-term in duration, like Colombia, that lasted a few hours, right? The president came out 2 Sundays ago and said, Colombia's not taking this airplane, I'm going to use tariffs on you. And then there was a social media fight because you had two world leaders there that make policy through social media. That was destined to be a problem. And then, and by the end of the day, early the next morning, those tariffs never went on. And that was, quote, resolved, unquote. We may see this come up from time to time. We may see this. I don't know how many people were doing business in Canada, or excuse me, in Colombia, and expected to wake up that morning hearing about tariffs. Very few. The next is Mexico, Canada. The president has been talking about this since basically election day, that he was going to put 25% tariffs on all products of Canada, Mexico, and that's what we saw announced on Saturday. Most of us haven't slept a lot lately because of this, but 25% for all products in Mexico. It was tied to immigration, border, fentanyl, and when those executive orders came out, there was a whole other list. Human trafficking. There was a variety of things and a series of allegations. The Mexican government's in with the cartels. Canada's a central problem, et cetera, et cetera. Although I will say, if you look at the 3 executive orders that went out on these tariffs over the weekend, Canada probably got away the best, not so much in the damage, but in terms of the accusations against the Mexico one was pretty strongly worded, so was the China one. Canada was mostly about really a public health crisis, the strains on the public health system, and even recognized there's not that much coming across from Canada, but just a little bit of fentanyl can help people. Now, as we know, those tariffs were originally set at 25%. That's what they are for all products of Canada and Mexico. And there was a carve out, and again, we were very close to that issue, 10% for energy products. That energy products is a definition that goes back to the other national emergency order. Energy products is defined in the day 1 statement of national emergency on energy, and maybe somebody that you're looking at right now helped come up with that linkage. But what's challenging is that energy products in that executive order is not necessarily aligned with how that's defined in customs law. So there's a list of products there that doesn't always line up. So there is going to be an open question as to which energy products by HS code fit into that exception, and that's going to be up to customs. This morning, customs did release. They were planning on the tariffs to go on today. On February 1st, or target for implementation for today, February 4th, excuse me. And then customs actually clearly was prepared because they put the notices out this morning in the cargo systems messaging service. But and you could see, but they didn't add clarity in the CSMS system as to what energy products would be. So there's still some open questions, but we have now suspended these tariffs, as I think everybody knows by now, for 30 days to March 4th. So on Mexico and Canada and North America, there's 30 days to negotiate. On China, as Samir led off, China was caught up in this process as well. We're gonna be hearing a lot about China. China, of course, now has 10% largely tied to fentanyl and opioids. That went into effect at midnight last night. That's why many of us were talking first thing very early this morning on this issue, and that is for all products of China. And we'll come back more into the specifics here in a moment. Next slide. So on this, when you look at the rest though, everything that I just told you is just section G on that list. But there are a number of others that fall into this bucket, and I think the most important would be steel and aluminum reviews. And I say that because the steel and aluminum report arguably was already done. Those tariffs were in place, countries cut deals. So if there was something done, we may not have to wait that long, right? There may be, hey, Canada, Mexico, et cetera, is not in accordance with its deal that we cut the last time, and there's a handful of other countries. There's also an economic and security review, and all of these roads. So these, again, are kind of one-off. When I said they were singular or sectoral, they also kind of fit under the security framework, right? So you're looking at national security, you're looking at emergency powers, but all of those, Commerce is leading that report that'll be produced by April 1st. Now coming to the more, I think the broader one on the next slide is that when we talk about transformational or transitional, not a little tongue-tied there, transformational or transitional tariffs, these are the tariffs, this is the core of the president's trade strategy. These are designed to reduce trade deficits. You will hear the president say reciprocal, which I think is misspelled, but what you will see is the president, anybody that's gone down to Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere has heard the president in the last 18 months say that word, reciprocal, 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 my reciprocal tariff plan. And the idea here is that the United States lets certain products in, say at 2.5%, and other countries don't. They are products, or for a variety of reasons under international trade law, are at 15% or 10%. And the president just believes that's unfair. That's his statement. He is going to propose 10 to 20% global supplemental tariffs. If you look at what he's saying, those global supplemental tariffs will be flat and uniform across all countries with which we have a deficit, which is pretty much everybody but one country. And Canada, it would be the second country, because you can argue if we have a deficit or not. So any major country in the world, even minor country, we have a deficit with. And the idea would get 10 to 20%. The number may move up or down. Nobody knows at this point. But the idea is the scorecard will be the deficit. So you come to us, the European Union, we have a trade deficit with you, or country X within the European Union, a member state, and tell us how you're going to reduce our trade deficit. We'll agree to that, we'll do a deal, and we'll keep the tariffs on until we see the number move. And look, there's going to be a dialogue. The Commerce Department, Secretary of Commerce, by April 1st will publish the report on the deficits. I've called this sacred writ because that's going to be the report that lays out everybody's number. Who do we have a deficit with, and what's the number, and why? Why the United States thinks it is. That's going to be the list. So if I was a country, I'd be engaging on that process as soon as the Commerce Secretary is confirmed, which may be just in a few hours. And then the Treasury Department is going to be is tasked with coming up with the way to use the to create the External Revenue Service, which will do basically part of what USCBP does today, which is collect these tariffs. And the question is going to be how that relationship is going to work. Why is it Treasury? Because it's money. And all of these, I keep saying Commerce, Treasury, et cetera. In the memo, it lists they will coordinate with a bunch of other agencies as well. So, but these are the leads. So on the next slide, you'll see also in this core pillar, the United States Trade Representative, once confirmed, is going to look at unfair trade practices like we did with China. So they're going to go country to country. There's an annual report that we do anyway that looks at unfair trade practices, but that's actually being finalized. But that will be there. They're going to look at areas where can we launch International Trade Commission investigations? Are there areas we can use IEPA 122, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that report is there. We're looking at our free trade agreements to see, are they fair? Are we seeing balance in those deals? And if we're going to look for areas where we can have new deals, I would look at Africa in particular to be an area that we're going to be looking at, and sectoral deals. Maybe we don't need to do a deal, a full free trade agreement, but can we do a deal with you on critical minerals? Can we do a deal with you on stuff? It's going to be on stuff that we need that we don't have, right? And what will we give you to? And then currency manipulation, de minimis, and we're also going to be looking at the World Trade Organization, GPA. And then next slide, Samir. And then the third basket, of course, is China. And USMCA review. I'll come back to this in a moment, but just know it's in that core basket. We're not going to talk a lot today about the USMCA, but this is the new NAFTA. This was scheduled for a review on July 1st of 2026, where the countries would say, yes or no, we want to stay in this for another 16 years, but that was done at year 6 of the original term. So we still have 10 years left after 2026. But the idea was after 6 years, we'll know if what we did back in 2020 worked. And then that gives us another 10 years if we don't agree. The belief was that the countries would come in July. At least one country would say we got some stuff to work on, but we'd get at least 10 years to work it out. The president has accelerated that review to right now. This review is happening right now, at least within the United States, the public comment, and you can see there's a list of issues there. I'll come back to that as well. And then next slide, please, Samir. And then China. I'm not going to take a large deep dive. We have 10% tariffs, but the United States Trade Representative is reviewing the phase 1 deal. This was the deal President Trump struck with China, where China agreed to buy certain products, agricultural products, address joint ventures, deal with intellectual property, and there was a list of commitments. Some, but certainly the purchase commitments have not been met. And so the idea is that China's violated that deal, and the president's going to say, you violated the deal, here's the consequences. Those tariffs will likely be bumped. USTR is going to review the Biden 301 report. So the Biden administration, this may be the only thing this administration keeps from the Biden administration. We're going to use the homework that USTR did, because Ambassador Tai and USTR basically continued a lot of what the Trump administration did and added on. I'm not sure they would like to hear that, but that's in practice what happened. And so they're going to use that report. But I think interestingly here and importantly is it's not just looking at China, it's looking at circumvention. So it's looking at areas where China has used third countries, and top of that list is going to be Mexico. So Mexico will be highlighted there. You can see, and the biggest one here on some other things is ultimately, should we remove permanent normal trade relations with China, which means the fallback to that would be some tariffs would automatically kick in with China, but we would also then have to review every year to keep them in a relation, a more preferential trade relationship with them. This is one of the things that many people consider the way we got off track when it came with China, is when we gave China PNTR, and Congress would be intimately involved on that. So what does this all mean as you go, as you think about this framework? What just happened? You know, pre-inauguration, we know all the noise. But one of the things that happened is that when Canada, we all know Prime Minister Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago, but Canada did a raid of fentanyl in places. Mexico started doing some raids, a major cartel raid, and then did some things with the maquiladoras, not letting fast fashion products go in. Now they've rolled some of that back. In week one, you know, this week on these tariffs, Canada, I think, felt pretty good. After they were not announced on day one, I can tell you, I've never seen a country so happy they were not in an inaugural speech than Canada was. But Mexico, all rumblings we've been hearing is that Mexico still needed to do action on the cartels. We saw the memo we just discussed, and the president was just hammering away as he does. Last week, this is an important piece. There's two reasons why last week may have looked a little chaotic. One is that not everybody's confirmed, as Samir pointed out. So Treasury had just been confirmed, Commerce wasn't there, and USTR wasn't there in this trade policy team. So we were missing some folks. They were on lockdown, and in fact, they were hard to get a hold of last week. So a lot of these decisions were being made by Peter Navarro and Kevin Hassert and others within the White House. And ultimately, as we know the way this White House works, that's the president. Additionally, the subject matter of these issues are not just trade issues, they're security, immigration issues. And so you had the border czar, Mr. Homan, who's certainly understands the security issues, but he was negotiating with Canada and Mexico. And I think at some point, people felt very confident in their proposals on the security side. But when it came back to the trade side on Friday and Saturday, those deals were not ready to go. And so we just didn't have that policy coordination in the same way that we expect to have on a go forward. So in the next slide, so this one was a little bit different, but what we know is, as I said at the outset, we have 30 days in North America. Mexico did not announce the retaliation, but our understanding is that it has 500 tariff lines and it's a carousel. So certain products will cycle in and cycle off. So you don't really know if you're ever safe. The idea is it creates uncertainty. And Canada announced 2 stages of retaliation, really in the first stage of about just between 25-30 billion, depending on if you count real money or not. And it was really targeted at Republican districts, including here in Ohio, because we make a lot of consumer goods in Cincinnati, great companies like Procter & Gamble. We make a lot of appliances, we make food, we make jams, we make jellies, we do a lot here. And we're also the home of the vice president. So that became big. And then China is, of course, sitting there at 10%. One of the things in the interim, when all of this was going on, the president talked about a lot of other tariffs that are coming in the next few weeks. And I'll go ahead to the next slide, Samir, and then because I'm mindful of our time. But this is, as at the outset, we know this is what folks want to know about. But what are the legal issues? There's no exclusions, no exceptions in these tariffs. So they're kind of hanging in suspended animation. They also, because they learned the lessons of the Section 301s, tariff mitigation strategies that we use, and there's no drawback, which is when you take goods, pay duties, manufacture, and then export it. No drawback. Use of foreign trade zones a little bit tricky because the date that it goes into the zone is locked in. The product of is a little bit different, but what I would flag for people that were not already paying China tariffs, so basically you list 4B people that are now paying China tariffs, there's a little bit of a quirk here because we didn't use the term originating. So if a Chinese good, for example, comes into Mexico or Canada and qualifies for USMCA treatment as part of that manufacturing process, so it's a product of the USMCA, right? It's a product, a duty-free treatment. But what CBP has done over the years of the China tariffs is said it still has to go through another test, the substantial transformation test, which is a fact-based test, but it's usually in the eye of CBP. If they, the substantial transformation can be loose. So if CBP says, yeah, that may meet the rules of USMCA, we still think that's a product of China. And so for those of you, particularly in that consumer product area that were in list 4B that are now running things through Mexico, Canada, as part of your manufacturing process, you need to take a hard look at that, because that layer is there. I said earlier, we cross-reference to other issues on energy products. Is again, that term's really not defined by customs standards. So there's a kind of a gray area there. And then the biggest news, I think, of last night, on top of the 10%, was we have removed de minimis treatment. So that basket of $800 goods that then comes into the United States is no longer getting duty-free treatment under Section 321. So what we see is often containers from China will go into Lake Long Beach, Los Angeles, ship in bond to Mexico, or if they come in north, or they'll come into Vancouver, Prince Rupert, into warehouses in Canada and Mexico. The whole container will come through, it'll clear, doesn't pay China tariffs, right? And then those are deconsolidated into $800 packages and end up at your doorstep. If your house is like mine, Amazon and UPS are probably showing up a few times a day. Those packages now are subject to duties. And so A, if that's your company's using that, there's an issue. B, the administrative burden on CBP is going to be significant at this point, even though they say it's not. So Samir, I want to quickly move back to your sections, but if we can just wrap up the last of these slides. What do we expect? Canada and Mexico were first. And that's because the border issues were the president's #1 priority, but there is always this issue is that we have to tighten up North America if we are going to build a wall around it. Those are our neighbors. What we are now accelerating and reviewing USMCA with 25% tariffs hanging over Canada and Mexico's head, and a looming 10 to 20% global supplemental due on April 1st. And so one of the things is if you get rid of USMCA, that duty-free treatment, for a number of products, it'll fall back to what's called most favored nation at 2.5%. So a number of companies, particularly non-North American automakers, the Japanese in particular in Mexico, have said, you know what, the compliance with USMCA is too hard. We'll eat the 2.5% duty. You're not going to get that option this time, because we will potentially have global supplemental tariffs at that number. And so the real question out there is the goal of this leverage to get concessions in USMCA, which are going to be very difficult for Canada and Mexico to give, or are they to get Canada and Mexico to agree to a global supplemental tariff at a certain amount? So we would not have duty-free treatment in the United States. It would be at a flat rate. And then, the question is, everybody out in the world right now is going to be getting a look at what their trade deficit number is. April 1st, by the way, we've been told is the deadline. It may be done before that. And then the real question is, the president then can focus his time and energies on China. Are we going to cut a deal or no deal and have a tariff war? So as we move forward, Samir, that into the next slide, we can talk more about companies, what your job, and we will do a lot of technical briefings. But one thing I will tell you right now is the message that does not work with this administration, trust me, is that we have to manufacture there or we're not competitive. Like 60% of a US automotive is made in Canada, or is US content that then goes to Mexico or Canada and comes back. They don't care. They're saying that 40% should be done in the United States. But if you can tell them we have invested X amount of dollars and this is how many jobs in the United States, those are the numbers they want to hear. Focus on their priorities: energy, security, defense. Know your bill of materials. Also, if you are subject to tariffs right now, look at the special circumstances, special tariff, Section 98, agricultural equipment. Those are all in the HS codes, and we can talk to you. And I will tell you right now, be very careful with people, particularly your Chinese suppliers, saying, oh, we can just change the value when it crosses the border. We'll just change the value number. The computers in the sky, if they've seen that product come over and over at a certain value and all of a sudden it's less because you're trying to pay less, that's not going to get cleared, and you're going to have a lot of problems. So there are a number of strategies that we can work on and talk to you about, but again, and get into the technical briefing, and then know your contract. Start looking at your force majeure terms, change circumstances, government action, and know who's on the hook for paying duties. It's the importer of record, but some companies just don't know who the importer of record is in their contract. So moving on. And then, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. It's basically the same message to countries that are negotiating. I know we have a number of our friends from the diplomatic world here on the line. Like I said, the model, they don't want to hear about integrated trade. They just don't want to hear about it. So if it's not, they don't want to hear about inflation. They don't want to hear you're going to tell them it's cost more. Trade deficits don't matter. They want to hear what investment is coming in the United States and how are you going to answer that cost of supply. So, and then I'll turn it over to you, Samir, to round out the rest.
Sure, thanks, Dan. Just quickly to go over some of the other trade initiatives that are going to be the focus of this administration. Now, tariffs are the big thing, and that is why we spent so much time on tariffs. But there are other areas, such as forced labor. Now, there is expected to be a continued focus on forced labor, particularly coming from China. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he actually co-sponsored the original act, the UFLPA. And so there is this sense that that's around to stay. And plus, it has been used recently as a negotiating tool against China. And because of the focus on China, there is every indication that enforcement will ramp up, that more entities will be added, more entities in China, even outside of the Xinjiang region, if they have any sort of touch or any sort of reach into those areas. So this will just continue to be increased. Show you the next slide here, if I can. Thanks. So sanctions and other export initiatives. So Russia, Ukraine, usually, obviously we've heard that Trump has publicly pressured Putin to come to the negotiating table to end the war. During the election, Trump had said, if he was president, the war would end on day one or very quickly soon after. Since taking office, there hasn't been as much talk other than little things here and there. It's sort of been put on the back burner. The interesting thing is usually in the last 3-4 years, in late February, around the anniversary of the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which was February 24th, President Biden had put in additional sanctions or other measures placed on Russia, just to mark the anniversary, to say we're still doing it, we're still putting in place certain sanctions. By the end of this month, if depending on what happens around the anniversary, it'll sort of be a good indication of where we're going and how we're going to see things related to Russia with the new presidency. So that's sort of a more wait and see approach. Sanctions in general, if you can go to the next slide, Scott, I think you're controlling it now. Yeah, so sanctions generally, you noticed that when I spoke earlier about the end of Biden's term, there were a lot of different sanctions and export controls that were being put in place. President Trump comes right out of the gate, tariffs. So the big question is, will he continue to use sanctions as a tool? The recent conflict with Colombia, and even on that day specifically, with the plane not being able to land in Colombia and him immediately saying, hey, we're going to invoke 25% tariffs. It was interesting that he used that instead of any sanctions. There were certain visa sanctions being imposed, but not the normal sanctions that you would have seen perhaps take place with other presidents. There have been certain statements coming out of the administration, particularly from Scott Bessent, that sanctions may have not been as effective as we have hoped and are often overused. However, the America First memo does indicate that they may consider trade measures to incentivize compliance with export control enforcement and the sanctions. So, this is really to be seen, and we need to make sure that companies are remaining flexible as we go forward with sanctions. Recent actions, there was the other recent actions related to sanctions. On January 20th, when President Trump revoked a whole series of executive orders, one of the executive orders that was revoked was EO 14115, which targeted persons engaging in violence towards civilians or Palestinians in the West Bank. That was one of the main sort of sanctions executive orders. A lot of the other ones still remained in place. Again, like I mentioned earlier, Trump has publicly pressured Putin to come to the negotiating table, but really query what sort of the hard way is with economic sanctions when there's sort of this discourse within the administration about how effective it all really is. I'm going to skip these ones. The China policies we've talked about, currency manipulation Dan touched upon as well. Just to finish up with some trade potpourri. Trade remedies. The 2024 was a record year for investigations, and we only expect this to continue. There are currently 117 active investigations. We assume that there will be a number of more anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations instituted this year as another one of these tariff-centric ideas to impose tariffs on the flow of goods, particularly from China and maybe some of the other related countries or non-market economies. Even the America First memo mentioned this, and there was going to be a review of the AD/CVD policies, which includes zeroing. Zeroing is when you look at certain inputs and make them zero, and it sort of influences the amount of tariff you can place on the AD/CVD. There's also the circumvention risk, the idea that that countries are using other means to bring goods into the United States, either circumventing the regulations. There's going to be some heightened diligence related to that, the use of third countries or third parties to do so. And there's an increased sort of tools to combat these through the various reporting methodologies, which we will see. Dan, you want to talk about government procurement programs really quickly?
Yeah, we'll just end in saying one of the things, or as we wrap up, is one of the areas that was probably before the election and even in the fourth quarter of last year was just on Build America, Buy America, because with the as otherwise known as BABA. So this is when the Infrastructure Act came out, in the Biden administration, and again, this isn't a policy criticism, but the funding spigots were open, right? Whether it was infrastructure, whether it was CHIPS, whether it was IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and a lot of that money came with strings attached for government contracts. And Build America, Buy America, BABA, put very strict requirements, including certainly for steel and aluminum. On the far end, construction materials needed to be 100% made in the United States, but for manufactured products. So if a product had needed it to be 55% the cost of the components made in the United States and with the of U.S. origin, and then the final assembly step needed to be in the United States. So those two coming together become a bit tricky. What we don't know right now, and agencies were doing a bunch of things, including Federal Highways, removed a general exemption that existed since 1982 for manufactured products. And what that did now is country companies all over that are supplying to build our infrastructure are like, ooh, we don't qualify. Now, we've been relying on that exemption forever, along with the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement. That is particularly important to Canada. For Canadian companies are able to do that so that they are not able to, that they can qualify. And so we look at these issues all the time. The question right now is, does Build America, Buy America, BABA even exist in the Trump administration? So I will say this right now, I flag this at this point because of some of the rollbacks that it is very important if you have government contracts or you're supplying projects that are funded with financial assistance, schools, hospitals, anything to do with universities, et cetera, roads, that the market's very uncertain right now on what your trade compliance obligations are if you're using any types of imports at all. So that's something where folks like myself need to get in there with our government contracts team and look over your contracts. And so we'll just wrap up, Samir, with some final comments. Yeah, and I just think on this, we've touched on this. Right now, what you should be doing, if you don't know your product from top to bottom, your bill of materials needs to be laid out because these tariffs are coming. And then what's your HTS US codes? If you're not a regular trade person, and you need to know how to do that. You know, talk to the folks that are doing the importing for you, UPS, FedEx, Purelator, whoever you use. But you also need those codes, your country of origin. So it's not just your manufacturing bill of materials, it's the whole thing. Also, you got to know your suppliers. It's like a Biggie Small song, right? It's like a Notorious B.I.G. You got to get back and take a deep dive into that sourcing, so that we can't rely anymore on just saying my supplier told me they were good. You got to go back and actually use reasonable care to get back there. And you should be reviewing your INCO terms, the terms of your contracts, to say who's the importer of record here, who's paying these duties. I mean, these are some very basic issues, but these are the questions we keep hearing each and every day. And then if you don't know who your logistics providers are, or who's paying for costs and detentions, when these tariffs go on, and there will be tariffs, make no mistake about it, there are going to be tariffs, that we are going to see supply chain disruption. Like, will it rise to the level of COVID? I don't know, but it's going to come pretty close. And so all of those transportation issues, you have to be ready for, like we did just a few years ago. So I'll end there. I think there's some final comments. And if you want to go ahead, Samir, go ahead, lead that one.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know we went a little over, and I really appreciate everyone staying on the line. I see a lot of people stayed, most people stayed. We do have a number of questions that we received, particularly in the last 10 minutes. What we'll do is Dan and I will go through all of those questions and email each of the individuals who have sent questions in, and get back to you that way, in the interest of everybody's time here today. So in final closing, I guess a quick plug here. If you're not currently receiving our updates, we invite you to Thompson Hine's website to receive our mailings under the publications tab, as well as the Thompson Hine Smart Trade blog, where we'll be talking about a lot of this. Feel free, again, to reach out to either one of us. The CLE code is in the chat room. If you are seeking CLE for today's program, the tracking code is TH8495. That's TH8495. It's also in the chat. Thanks again to everybody. Thanks again for your interest in today's program. Please remember to check the chat box for the link to the attendance survey. Please fill out the optional feedback form. The link is provided there. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed today. Please join us next week. We have another one coming up on Tuesday at 2 p.m. I think that one's involving the recent revocation of affirmative action and the implications for EEO compliance and DEI programs. It'll be headed by Matt Kissling and Chip Purcell. So I really hope you enjoyed that. And thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. See ya.